Well, it's a great honor to be here in front of you today, folks. As I think you could tell from the bio, or from the pedigree or whatever, that, I learned an awful lot of stuff in my life from you folks in this room right here and in this state. It's been, my grandkids still live here, my in-laws still live here, my daughter still lives here, etc. Just this state holds a very near and dear place in my heart, trust me. I want to begin our conversation today a little bit differently, but almost pick up on some of the themes that President Hearst just visited with us about. We put a long-term planning group together at Farm Bureau just as I came on board in 2003, and basically took about 2 years and looked at all of agriculture. Boy, I'm getting a lot of feedback on this. We'll get it settled down here, I'm sure. But as that group got started, this was just about the time that Tom Friedman had come out with a couple of his books. The Lexus and the Olive Tree was one that was certainly out to begin with. Made sure we shipped that to all 26 members of that committee, and they all read the book. And in fact, they did, because we actually gave them a test. But went through that conversation, and at the end of that 2-year process, we were then had the opportunity to go actually listen to Tom Friedman speak at a luncheon event. And as Tom Friedman was kind of wrapping up his presentation and wrapping up his speech, he came up with this kind of closing line, which has kind of stuck with me quite a bit since then. And the line basically went like this: 20 years ago, God comes to you and God says, you can be born in one of two places. You can be born in Mumbai, India, or you can be born in St. Louis, Missouri. And 20 years ago, what would your answer to that question have been? Probably without thought, I want to be born in St. Louis. Probably wouldn't have even thought about it. What would your answer necessarily be today? Would you at least kind of think about it just a little bit? Let me just kind of put it this way. In April of 2008, Mumbai was ranked, as you can see there, 7th in the list of top 10 cities for billionaires. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of folks in Mumbai that are absolutely not billionaires. But I'd also point out that over that same 20-year period of time, we've actually seen a decline in population in St. Louis of about 50,000 folks or so. So I want you to keep that in mind as we kind of go through some of this conversation today, because we're going to come back to that in a little bit different form when we get toward the end of this conversation and talk about wrapping it up. Agriculture today, as President Hearst just mentioned to you, is one of the things they teach in Extension. Dean Payne, you know this. He brings all of his new extension folks in, sits them down, lashes them to a chair, beats them with a hose for about 4.5 hours and says, never, 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 ever, 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 never, ever, ever tell a farmer he's making a profit. And you know that. So the challenge becomes, where are we today? Well, today, quite frankly, as President Hearst just mentioned, we are sitting on, and these numbers just came out last week from Economic Research Service at USDA, and basically says that agriculture is in as good a shape today as it has frankly ever been. I will tell you that I came to work for Farm Bureau, as I mentioned, in 2003. In 2003, we talked about farm cash receipts to agriculture that were about $218 billion. For this year, we're going to talk about cash receipts to agriculture about $366 billion. I won't take all the credit, but I'll take a look. Again, this has been just an amazing story. And it's been an amazing story even just over the last 4 years. That over the last 4 years, we've gone from $290 billion to $365 billion. Now, most of that has come, admittedly, an awful lot of that growth has come in the crop sector. $50 billion of that increase come from the crop sector. And I think we all understand a lot of the reasons for that we've talked about. Just an explosion in demand. We picked up over that period of time about another 3.5, 4 billion bushels of corn demand for ethanol use. We've talked about very strong export markets for our products. We've talked about China emerging and just sucking up about every soybean that they can get their hands on. Livestock sector's not done too bad. Picked up about $30 billion roughly or so over that period of time. But I would also tell you that if I look out in front of us over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, I'd probably be a little bit more optimistic about growth in livestock than I would necessarily in that same kind of rate of growth in the crop side. I just can't get us to quite that rate of growth in the crop side, mainly because we've You know, we've hit the 15 billion gallon mark, if you will, already for the ethanol, and for years out in front of us, we're probably going to hold at that level, or what growth we do get, we can probably pretty much pick up just out of yield growth and things of that nature. Direct payments, we can see those numbers. The other one that I want to take you to is this cash expense number. The cash expenses have gone up as well. Here's a $46 billion jump over those 4 years from 2007 to 2011. But again, you do talk about a total net farm income number of over $100 billion. I'm not quite so sure that next year we're going to be able to talk about a number quite that high. If you told me that you thought that farm income was going to drop down into the $95 billion range or so, certainly I would probably agree with you on that front, or wouldn't argue with you too much on that front. You know, one of the things, as was talked about, I was on faculty here at the University of Missouri for quite a while, and one of the challenges that you always had was as students came through was they'd come to you, and you know, and we built big computer models of the sector at FAPRI and all that good stuff, and you'd get a student come to you and they would talk to you about the accuracy of the model out to the 4th decimal point. And you know why economists talk about decimal points? Because they got a sense of humor. And you know, there's our 3 kinds of economists: those that can count and those that can't. So as you come back through these, this has been an amazing story. And quite frankly, when you look across the economy as a whole at this point in time, the bright spot in the economy today is frankly you folks. And you know that. You may not, individual producers are facing individual challenges, admittedly. And the folks up in the northeast part of the state with the droughts that we had, or the floods that we had, the folks down in the Boot Heel, whole different story. But you know that at this point in time, agriculture is actually in pretty good financial shape. In fact, if you look at the balance sheets, not just at the cash flow statements like these, but look at the balance sheets, we're actually going to end up with a lower debt amount coming out of agriculture in 2011 than we had coming out of 2010. We're talking about net worth of the agricultural sector of over $2 trillion. Never been that high. Admittedly, a bunch of that's paper worth and all that good stuff, but so what, you know? There it is. Because there's other sectors of the economy that, quite frankly, just ain't doing quite so well. This happens to be new housing starts. And one of the numbers that the National Association, or the National Home Builders Association, will come to you and say that every new housing start generates someplace between 2 and 3 jobs. So let's just come back and look at what the historical data would say. This actually is 1990 back over here. This was the peak that we had, would have been of late 2006 or so. And notice that we went from about 1.8 million new housing starts on an annual basis in late 2006 to where we're now talking about new housing starts of only about 400,000 or so. One of the interesting pieces of data you can get out of the Center for Disease Control. Why does the Center for Disease Control collect this data? I don't have the foggiest clue, but they actually collect data on how often a fire department will respond to a house fire call. And in 2006, they responded to about 450,000 house fire calls. Well, okay, if we're only building about 400, or starting about 450,000, we're burning them down about as fast as we're building them right now. But the thing I want you to take off of this graphic is to notice that, again, we're talking about, we were building houses at the rate of 1.8 million. Now we're down to about 400,000. 1.4 million housing drop in housing starts. Let's just take the conservative number of 2 jobs per house. That's about 3 million job loss from the peak to where we are today. And quite frankly, folks, that's a sector of the economy that I don't know that any of us see coming back for a long time to come. And you'll see that show up in the employment data as well. Just so you know, this is back over here on the far left. This is 2007. This is where the recession ended. These brownish areas here are areas where unemployment rates were in excess of 10%, or I'm sorry, 9%. And what you've got here are, these are cohorts of what percentage of the unemployment, or the folks that were unemployed by less than 5 months, 5 to 14 months, 15 to 26 months, and then over 27 months, or basically read that as more than 2 years. And I want you to notice that we're now talking about, and we have been for some time, that about 4% or so of our population has been unemployed for over 2 years. And in fact, when you looked at the unemployment numbers that came out last week, that talk about a drop in the unemployment rate down to about 8.6%. Why did the unemployment rate drop by 8.6%? It wasn't because we created all that many new jobs. It was basically because folks just said, I'm not looking anymore. I'm done. I'm out of the workforce. And so understand that we have never seen a recession with the cohort of folks unemployed for a particular period of time with this large a number of folks that have been unemployed for that long a period of time. We've never had a recession this way. And I will apologize to you, I couldn't get the data from back in the 1920s to see if we could have compared it that way, but we've never had a recession this way. I would also tell you though, as you go back through the last 3 recessions that we've had, this recession, the 2000 recession, the 1990 recession, we have tended to move to longer and longer time periods for us to get back up to the same number of jobs in the economy as we had at the previous peak. Historically, we'd come into a recession within 2 to 3 years. You'd be back to the same number of jobs that you had at the previous employment peak. We're going to be probably 6, 7 years before we get back to the same number of jobs in this country as we had before we came off of the peak that we had in 2007. We're also facing this same problem. At the same time we're talking about this massive kind of unemployment, we're also talking about, as you know, if this is news to you, welcome back from your latest trip to Mars. But we certainly have been operating, as you know, for a number of years here with just growing, significant growth in federal debt. This basically would start January 2000 or so. And you'll notice here for most of 2000, debt stayed at about that about $5.6 trillion range or so. Then we talked about tax cuts, we talked about war in Iraq, we talked about war in Afghanistan, et cetera, growth in the federal debt. This big blip that you see right here, this is actually daily total federal debt to the penny, just if you were worried about our accuracy. Again, economists have a sense of humor. We'll talk about decimal points. This is basically TARP. And we added over a period of just a few days about $1 trillion to our total federal debt. Now, you can say that was a bad thing. You can say we shouldn't do that, you know, yada, yada. You can come back with all those lines. And I guess the line that I would come back to you with is, have you watched Europe here over the course of the last couple of years as Europe has just lurched from crisis to crisis, from one country deciding they're going to go bankrupt to another? You know, first it was Greece, then it was Ireland, then it's, you know, maybe it's going to expand to Italy, maybe it's going to expand certainly Spain, et cetera, et cetera. The only reason we didn't face that kind of problem here, it would have been a bank problem, not a sovereign debt problem, but the only reason we didn't face that problem here was because we did this. And because the planet believed that we did have the full faith and credit of the United States behind it to be able to make that happen. That you dumped a lot of money into the system and you dumped it in a hurry and dumped it with conviction. Europe has just kind of dribbled it out and has not made the kind of fundamental steps and fundamental reforms that they're going to have to make. But here we are sitting now on $15 trillion worth of debt. And this is probably the largest, we've gone through over the course of the last 8 to 10 years, kind of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth. And what do I mean when I say that? Who's going to pay this bill? That one that's walking out of the room right now. I'd be crying too if I were her. So when you think about it, I mean, this is going to generate real challenges for us. This is also the same, and then when you think about it, we've come back through with the Debt Commission. The Debt Commission went through its effort. This actually was the timeline that they set up for themselves. You know, we had the debt ceiling increase. We talked about the appointment of the commission itself. This October 14th date that each committee of jurisdiction in the House will report recommendations for cuts for the program under its jurisdiction. I want to point out a couple words here. Notice the first word there was each. Each committee. How many committees did that? You remember? Well, recognizing that you have basically a duplicate committee in the House and a duplicate committee in the Senate, the same committees, let's call that one committee, only one. And who was that one committee that stepped forward and said, yeah, we'll put $23 billion worth of savings on the table? And that was agriculture, exactly. No other committee did that. Now, you know, it's not necessarily that we were so magnanimous. Because basically what the deal was if you write this bill and we put it into this deficit package, then it will go to the House floor, it will go to the Senate floor, and it will basically be unamendable. So exactly what you write coming out of the committees is exactly what we'll pass. Up or down vote, yay or nay, part of a huge package. Boy, let me tell you, if you couldn't ask for a better procedural opportunity than what the committees were handed there, I don't know of a better procedural opportunity. So you can, I mean, it wasn't just that they were being nice guys. It was a very important opportunity for them to be able to move through. But the committee, as you know, the super committee, as you know, didn't do their job. That process fell apart, and now we are all back to square one. I would also tell you, though, that as the committees came through their process, one of the things that you saw was, quite frankly, each individual commodity group grubbing as hard as they possibly could to protect their own baseline, to protect their own projected spending for their particular commodity. So you ended up with a package that the chairman of the House and the chairman of the Senate Ag Committees put forward with 3 separate programs when it got right down to it. You basically had a program that the corn and soybean guys had been pushing pretty hard. You had a program that the rice folks had been pushing pretty hard, and some other folks in that category had been pushing pretty hard. And you had another program that the cotton folks had been pushing pretty hard. So you had 3 separate programs. The only thing I can say is I am damn glad I'm not the FSA administrator, because I don't know how you would have ever put the rules together to administer all 3 of those programs in the same county at the same time. I'm also damn glad I'm not an FSA county officer down in the boot heel of Missouri, because you could have had a producer come walking through the door for you, and you would have had to say, well, you can do this on that, you can do that on that, and you can do this on something else. And you got these payment limits on that program, you got these AGI limits on that program, and you got these provisions for that program over here. You know, I don't know how you would have ever administered that combination of programs, but there we are. So that's dead. That's past history. We're not there anymore. We're basically starting over with a blank sheet of paper. And the question becomes, what do you want to have in that next farm bill? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. In fact, I'm only going to put up one slide and just kind of ask you some basic questions. You know, we had a lot of folks that were very tied to direct payments. And believe me, I can come up with all kinds of economic reasons why you would. I can tell you as an economist, if my objective is to provide income transfer, if the objective is to just talk about income enhancement for folks that receive those program benefits, the most efficient, effective way to make that happen is a direct payment. Just write you a check here. And if we're going to do that on a year in, year out basis, in other programs we have another name for that. I'll let you figure out what that name is. Do you want a program instead, though, that kicks in when you have a shallow loss? 10% loss or so from what your expected revenue would have been, would pay you through some narrow band or whatever, and then kick back out. And basically, you know, once you break through the ice, you're on your own. You either go out and buy crop insurance, you self-insure, however you decide you want to do that, but government's just going to provide you with that kind of narrow band of protection. Or do you want a program that basically says, look, you got to face 25, 30% loss or so, but once you've moved through that kind of a loss zone, government's going to be there to step in and provide you with solid protection that you know is going to be there year in and year out. Certainly it's a different risk scenario, don't get me wrong. But you know, those are the kinds of questions that we've got to ask ourselves, I think, at this stage of the game, because again, we're going to come through this farm program or this farm bill debate in 2012. We're going to talk about substantially less money. And I would also tell you that the political will to extend direct payments, it's gone. You know, let's just put it that way and figure out where we're going to move from there. Let me also just kind of remind us about how we spend our money. And let's just work through these numbers, because I think this ends up being pretty telling. Those that were in the legislative session yesterday afternoon, we kind of got into some of this conversation. Understand the federal government at this stage of the game is basically borrowing about 40 cents on every dollar that it spends. So let's just work through those numbers. 22% of our federal spending goes for Medicare, 8% goes for Medicaid, so 22 plus 8, that's 30%. Defense spending is about 15%, so that's, 45%. Debt interest, 14%. Lo and behold, by the time you get to about here, you've pretty much already gone through the 60 cents on the dollar that you bring in. And so now everything else that we're going to do is borrowed money, is bills that we're going to pass to that kid that just walked out of the room. Well, actually, didn't walk, but I'm reminded, and I'm sure that everybody that's raised a daughter in this room and knows this conversation. I'm reminded of the time my daughter's in church and she's, yelling and screaming and kicking and carrying on, and I pick her up, throw her over my shoulder, I'm carrying her out of the room, and of course, what does she say? "Don't beat me, Daddy, don't beat me." No, okay, yeah. So here's everything else. And all that stuff that we're borrowing money from Japan, we're borrowing money from China, we're borrowing money from anybody else, the OPEC countries, anybody on the planet that'll loan us money, we're borrowing money from them at this stage of the game for this stuff. Now, you can say, well, wait a second, you should have arranged the pie different than you did. Fine. But let's just make the point here very strongly. All this stuff, is kind of the other part of government. It's the FBI, it's the CIA, it's food stamps, it's welfare programs, it's Department of Transportation, it's Department of Education, it's all that other stuff. And frankly, this gap is so big that we need to start having some very serious conversations about some very serious decisions that we're going to have to make. Don't ask me why I picked on hip and knee replacements, other than it seems like everybody in the community that I live in. The guy next door to me had 2 hips replaced here in the last month. Another one of my golf buddy's wife had her knee replaced. Another one of my guys in my golf group had a shoulder worked on. Yeah, I don't know, but we're all doing this. And the average cost of that stuff runs $30,000-$40,000 a shot. And that's what Medicare, Medicaid's paying for that stuff. Well, we're going to come down to a decision at some point in time where what's the proper place to invest that $35,000-$40,000? That's about the cost, not quite, but about the cost of an average Missouri teacher's salary. So we're going to have to come to decisions of, do you want the federal government to pay for grandmother's hip replacement? And I'm sorry, these are tough questions. Or do you want to talk about putting that second grade teacher in your grandkid's school? And those are the kind of tough decisions that we're going to have to come to grips with here in the not too distant future. In fact, you could really say that we're facing those decisions today. We also, I think, as President Hearst talked about, we need to think very strongly about, how we deal with this regulatory creep, this regulatory push. Because we're not making common sense decisions. We're certainly not making economic decisions when we talk about an awful lot of these environmental regs. Here's, as we talked about, child labor laws. That young lad could hit the wrong post of that battery and things could get pretty exciting there pretty quickly. But the whole dust issue, the whole challenge of the pipeline, the XL pipeline, the Keystone pipeline, the whole Chesapeake Bay issue. Actually, we live right there. If I could get steady enough, we live about right there. The whole Chesapeake Bay issue. Let me just talk about that for just a minute. Basically, the EPA has come in and said, almost literally watershed by watershed, here's the pollutant amounts that are going to be allowed per watershed. Now understand that historically, and if you read the Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Act says they should tell the states what to do, and then it's up to the states to decide how to implement those programs. That's not what EPA is doing. EPA is basically coming in and saying, this is how much per watershed within the state that you can talk about emitting or not emitting. Understand that if this rule proceeds, we're actually going to pay folks in the Chesapeake Bay area to take jobs out of the Chesapeake Bay region and move them someplace else. And we're going to find somebody that wants to create jobs within that watershed. Now, does that make any economic sense at all? But understand that the Chesapeake Bay is basically a test case. If they can get away with this there, again, the whole idea is that let's bring it over to the whole Mississippi basin and let's apply it here. So you can say, that's an East Coast problem. We don't have to worry about that. Don't delude yourself. This is merely the start of the whole process. So let me kind of close with this one, because I'm running out of my time here, and ask that question that I asked you to begin with a little bit different way. Again, I think there's a little, understand that the growth of the middle class, for example, in the United States and all of North America, over the course of the next 20 years or so, between now and 2030, for example, the growth of the middle class in North America is really going to be zero. Middle class is about the size that it's going to be because the population is not going to change all that much. And we spend about $5.5 trillion on stuff, goods and services, in North America. The middle class does in North America. And expectations are by 2030 that number is going to go in real terms from 5.5 to like 5.9 trillion bucks. Understand that in Southeast Asia, where we've got a middle class, and understand that Southeast Asia defines middle class substantially different from other parts of the planet, but how they define middle class, and about 500 or so million folks in the middle class in that part of the world. The Chinas, the Indias, the Burma or Myanmar, the Vietnams, et cetera, South Korea, about 500 or so million folks in that middle class. Expectations are by 2030 that number is going to go to 3.5 billion. That's a lot of folks. It also talks about spending from the middle class, going from that, about $6 billion or trillion dollars or so that they are today, to upwards of $55 trillion. So if you're somebody that wants to invest, you're somebody that wants to create a new business, do you want to create that new business in the United States or in North America? Or do you want to say, whoa, wait a second, look at all that growth, let's go there? Doesn't seem to me like it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how you might want to answer that question. So 20 years from now, God comes to your great-grandchild and says, you can be born in Mumbai or you can be born in St. Louis. What's the answer to that question 20 years from now? And if the answer to that question is even the remote possibility that that kid might want to say, well, the economic opportunities in Mumbai are far greater than they are in St. Louis, then it seems to me like we got a lot of work to do and a lot of challenges to take on. Probably the first one of which is to say, let's get a handle on $15 trillion of total federal debt and figure out how we get ourselves and get our financial house for the nation as a whole back in order. That seems like a real challenge to me. Thank you, folks. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Let me also say that you have one of the best state staffs and one of the best state farm bureaus in the entire country. And I've been with most of them. Thanks again, folks.